A mentally unstable woman develops a deadly obsession with her creative writing professor, and she won't let anything stand in the way of her dream fairy tale romance. At the Laughlin Institute for the Criminally Insane, Dr. John Sims speaks to the hospital director about their patient Debbie Strand. When the older man expresses his concern about the woman's instability and mentions how she ended both her mother's and grandmother's lives, the psychiatrist explains that the victims were physically abusing Debbie. However, the director also adds that the patient's romantic obsession with a doctor is worrying. Meanwhile, Debbie is strapped down to a hospital bed while Nurse Bates prepares her medication. The woman mocks the patient by revealing that she and the other nurses laughed when they read her poems for Dr. Sims. She says the only romance she'll ever experience for the rest of her life are the ones she reads in her books. Suddenly, Debbie manages to free one hand from a strap, uses it to grab the syringe from the tray, and injects the sedative straight into the nurse's neck. In the office, the two men hear the alarm, and Dr. Sims runs through the burning hospital to Debbie's room. There he finds the nurse's lifeless body on the bed. When he turns around, the heartbroken woman knocks him out with a blow to the head, then takes her book of poems from him. The next evening, Tracy Carley drives her car down a dark, deserted road. Suddenly, she almost runs over an unconscious woman, but manages to avoid her. Then she heads out of the vehicle to check on the person, but finds that she's no longer there. However, when she gets back in the car, she's surprised to find Debbie in the passenger seat, who frantically explains that they need to drive off before her abusive husband John finds her. Tracy tries to call the police on her cell phone, but the woman begs her not to because her parents will find out what her husband did. Because the patient changed into the nurse's uniform before escaping, Tracy assumes that she works in a hospital. She then shares that she's headed to Holmby College in San Carlos, and Debbie says she's always wanted to go to college to become a writer. The unaware woman says she'd love to trade places with her, especially since she's always wanted to be an actress, but her father, the owner of the Carley chain of hotels, wants her to follow in his footsteps. Minutes later, while the passenger is asleep, Tracy stops by a roadside gas station to use the restroom. There, the attendant turns her away because he's busy making love to a woman. Annoyed, the hotel heiress descends the steps and picks up a newspaper. To her shock, she sees Debbie's picture on the front page under a headline about a missing inmate from a mental asylum who burned down the building. When she turns around, the other woman startles her and asks why they stopped. Frightened, Tracy says she just needed to use the restroom, but it's closed. Frightened, she heads back to the vehicle, but Debbie has the keys. The escaped patient sees that she's on the paper and tries to explain that she isn't as bad as the article says. The scared woman reminds her that she killed 2 people, so Debbie reasons that Nurse Bates was always touching her inappropriately, while Dr. Sims made the other staff read her poems. She says all she wants is the woman's car and that she'll hide out in Mexico. However, Tracy holds her pepper spray in front of her, determined to fight back. Unfortunately, the nozzle is pointed towards her, causing her to stumble backwards and impaling herself on an upright iron rod. Stunned, Debbie picks up the woman's driver's license and realizes they look eerily similar. The next day, she heads to a bank in San Carlos where she withdraws several $1,000s from the hotel heiress's account. As she exits the building, she runs into a drunkard who says that she looks familiar. Annoyed, Debbie picks up the money she dropped but unknowingly forgets a $100 bill. In the parking lot, Deputy Toby Taylor is about to hand her a ticket for illegal parking when Sam Deckner intervenes to explain that the sign is obscured by the tree and the woman is from out of town based on her license plate. The cop agrees to let the woman off with a warning to her relief. After the deputy leaves, he introduces himself and hands her the $100 bill she dropped, and she remarks that he looks familiar. As he passes her car, he points out the Paco Sanchez book on the passenger seat and she says he's her favorite author. He explains that he's a creative writing professor at Holmby, then drives off on his motorcycle. Hours later, Debbie heads to the professor's office at the college. While seated at his desk, she reads a new email from his girlfriend Carla saying that she'll be at his office in 5 minutes. Suddenly, Sam arrives, and she hands him a box of El Capitan brand cigars because she found out he likes them from the About the Author blurb on his book. She said she realized he looked familiar earlier because she was one of the few people who read and loved his book, The Tempest. She finally introduces herself as Tracy Carley and says she'll be in his creative writing class. Moments later, Carla, an English literature professor, arrives to talk to her boyfriend, so Debbie excuses herself. However, she stands by the door to eavesdrop, where she learns that he is performing at a bar later tonight and that the girlfriend is asking him for some time away from their relationship. That evening, Debbie heads to her dorm where she meets the strict resident assistant, or RA, Sydney. The RA takes her to her room where she meets her roommate Lainey. Sydney informs her that students aren't allowed to leave the dorm past 11 p.m. on weekdays, and that she has the only key to open the door. Debbie pretends like she respects the RA's strict rules, but deftly takes the keys from the unaware student. After Sydney leaves, the woman opens a bottle of champagne and offers her roommate the drink. When the shy student declines, the woman says she needs to learn to enjoy her freedom at college. Soon, Debbie asks her computer-savvy roommate to help her send an email to Sam disguised as Carla, saying that she's leaving him for her colleague Jim. She also has Lainey send an email to Carla disguised as Sam, telling her that he's been seeing someone else. Meanwhile, in the English literature professor's home, she anxiously holds a positive pregnancy test. At midnight, Debbie coaxes Lainey to sneak out of the dorm using the stolen key, and they head to the bar where she knows Sam is playing. Outside the establishment, the woman starts a fire in a trash can in the alley to distract the bouncer, allowing them to sneak into the bar. Inside, she sees the professor performing on stage, so she and Lainey head to the bar to order drinks. Beside her, the drunkard from the bank continues pestering her about how she looks familiar. After the performance, Sam talks to Debbie for a bit before excusing himself to make a phone call. When the woman sees the bouncer searching the crowd for her, she takes her friend to the back alley. There, the drunkard intercepts them and says he finally realized she was the escaped inmate from Laughlin. After the intoxicated roommate throws up on his shoes, he pushes her to the ground. Then he and Debbie get into a scuffle, and he says there's probably reward money for her capture. Eventually, the woman ends his life using a 2x4 with nails to his head. She grabs a rag and wipes her fingerprints from the weapon before helping her drunk friend up on her feet. The next day, Lainey's cardigan is noticeably missing one of its sunflower buttons. The student wakes up with an intense headache, so Debbie hands her medication for the hangover. Then the roommate says she doesn't remember much from last night. At the crime scene, Sheriff Bill Taylor, Toby's father, searches for clues. He finds the leftovers of an El Capitan cigar with fresh lipstick on it. In the dorm, none of the students can leave the floor because Sydney lost the key, so Debbie says she found it in the bathroom, prompting the students to laugh at the embarrassed RA. Later, the cops discuss the case and mention how the 2x4 had no prints because the killer wiped it clean. Then the sheriff takes out an evidence bag with a sunflower button and, along with a lipstick on the cigar, thinks the perpetrator was most likely a woman. In Sam's class, Debbie arrives late on purpose, catching her male classmates' attention. After class, Buddy approaches her to introduce himself, but she isn't interested in his advances. Then she asks the professor to read one of her poems. In the cigar shop, the officers ask the owner if a woman recently purchased El Capitan cigars, and he says a lady bought a box for her teacher yesterday. In Carla's office, Debbie asks the woman if she's seen Sam, because they were supposed to take a ride on his motorcycle. Annoyed, the professor says she hasn't seen the man. After the student leaves, Carla looks out the window and sees her talking to Sam. She watches as Debbie gives the professor a hug after he says her poem was really good. In the office, Jim sees the upset literature professor and asks if she'd like to talk about it. That afternoon, Sydney barges into the room to ask Debbie where she really found the key. The woman insists she found it in the bathroom, but the skeptical RA doesn't believe her and shows that she's keeping the key on a chain around her neck. Unbeknownst to her, the woman already has her own copy of the key taped to the bottom of her desk. The next day, Sam informs the class that the English department is having its annual open house at Sutter Hall for students and teachers to get acquainted. After class, Buddy tells Debbie that he's the captain of the football team, but the woman doesn't care. The teacher intervenes and tells the male student and his friends to leave. Then the woman hands him her journal of poems and says he's the first person she's showing her deeply personal work. That evening, Debbie encourages her roommate to come to the party at Sutter Hall with her. When Lainey says she doesn't have anything to wear, the woman lends her a red dress and helps her style her hair. At the party, Buddy continues harassing Debbie, who finally dumps a plate of food on the annoying student. Fortunately, Sam intervenes and asks if he can speak to the woman. Moments later, the professor says he recognizes her talent and suggests he show his publisher her work. Delighted, Debbie gives the man a hug, which Carla and Jim see. Appalled, Jim approaches the pair and says the man should be ashamed of his actions, so Sam punches him. When Carla breaks up the scuffle, the creative writing director tells her to have the decency to break up in person, pertaining to the email he thought she sent. Offended, the woman slaps him and says she never wants to talk to him again. Because the man says he's leaving the party, Debbie decides to walk back to the dorm as well. However, Buddy jumps out from behind a tree to attack her. Thankfully, Sam saves her and says he's calling the police. However, the woman discourages him from reporting the incident. Later, the man takes her back to his office to put some ice on her sprained ankle. There she finds a bottle of wine and says they deserve a drink after the night they both had. Soon, the inebriated professor says his publisher expects his next manuscript in a month. He says he already received a cash advance, which he used to buy his motorcycle and an expensive guitar. Seconds later, he notes that it's getting late late, so Debbie suggests she can stay in the guest room at his house or they can get a motel. However, the man says the best he can do is take her to a motel but that he needs to go home. When he helps her up to her feet, their eyes lock and they share a passionate kiss. Eventually, the pair make love on the couch. After the deed, the woman reveals that that was the first time she slept with a man, surprising him. When they're about to make love again, the guilty teacher says they need to stop what they're doing because she's his student and that his life is really complicated at the moment. Heartbroken, Debbie walks out of the office and heads back to the dorm. She wakes her roommate by throwing stones at the window and instructs Lainey to use the key under her desk. Unfortunately, Sydney catches the woman sneaking in and says she'll report the both of them to the dean tomorrow. Panicked, Lainey laments she can't risk losing her scholarship, so Debbie calmly says she'll take care of it. The woman follows the RA to the bathroom, who says her father's name isn't going to help get her out of trouble. Out of ideas, Debbie asks Sydney how much money she'd like in exchange for her silence, and the RA says $20,000 by noon. Because she doesn't have the money, the deranged woman tosses a plugged-in blow dryer into the shower, electrocuting Sydney. Hours later, the roommates are jolted awake by the screams of the student who found the RA's corpse. After the body is wheeled away, Toby and Bill Taylor ask the roommates if they heard anything out of the ordinary around the time of the incident, and Debbie says they were asleep. The next morning, a troubled Lainey asks what her roommate meant when she said she'll take care of Sydney. So Debbie lies and says the RA asked for $2,000 and she had to find an ATM to pay her off. Later that day, the woman eavesdrops on Carla and Sam's conversation from outside his office. She learns that the reason the literature professor wanted time away from the relationship was because she's pregnant and didn't know how to tell him. He asks if she's sure the baby is his and not Jim's, bringing up the email she sent. However, the woman says he was the one who sent her an email that he was seeing someone else, so Sam insists that he's not dating anyone. After the reconciliation, the couple share a kiss and they make love on his desk. Furious and heartbroken, Debbie grabs a rock from the ground and hurls it at the window. Later, the sheriff and deputy arrive to investigate the incident. Bill asks the man if there's anyone he thinks might have it out for him, and he shakes his head. In Carla's office, Debbie confronts the woman, convinced that she trapped Sam by lying about being pregnant. The literature professor deduces that she was the one who threw the rock, and the student warns her to stay away from Sam. In the dorm room, Lainey remembers the drunkard mentioning Laughlin, so she searches for it on the internet. To her shock, she sees Debbie's picture on their website and discovers all the horrible things she's done. Suddenly, the crazy woman pops up behind her and says the people she killed all deserve what happened to them. The roommates fight over the phone, but when Lainey pulls on the cord, she ends up falling out of the open window and perishing on the concrete below. As the paramedics wheel her body away, the sheriff inspects her corpse and sees that her cardigan is missing a sunflower button. In Sam's office, Carla arrives to tell him that she thinks she knows who sent the emails and threw the rock in the window. Later, a sobbing Debbie tells the cops that her roommate was depressed and that she smoked cigars and drank a lot. That afternoon, Sam heads to the dorm to speak to Debbie, but when he asks another student, she says she's probably at the crisis counselor center after what happened to her roommate. At the bar, the bartender tells the cops that Lainey was there with a pretty brunette who was talking to Sam. That evening, Debbie sneaks into the professor's house to set up a romantic dinner for them. When he arrives, he apologizes for last night, says he loves her, and they make love by the fireplace. However, it was only the woman's dream, and when she wakes up, Sam and Carla walk in the door and he asks what she's doing in his house. She says she has a new poem for him about how they made love last night. Upon hearing the revelation, the pregnant woman leaves in a hurry. To convince the student that last night happened only because they had too much to drink, the professor says Carla is pregnant with his baby and he's asked her to marry him. However, Debbie says his girlfriend is lying, so Sam reiterates that he loves Carla and that he doesn't love her. Heartbroken, the crazy woman says she hates the literature professor and wishes she was dead. Later, the cops speak to Sam about Debbie and say that they think she might be in a lot of trouble. In her home, Carla closes the side door but is unaware that someone cut her phone line. Outside Sam's house, the sheriff thinks he might be keeping some details from them, so they decide to head over to his girlfriend's house. When Carla tries to use the phone, Debbie attacks her from behind with a knife, but she manages to push her down to the floor. While the disturbed woman searches the house, she hears a knock on the front door. The sheriff enters the house where he runs into the bat-wielding Carla. Suddenly, Debbie appears behind him, and when he turns around, she plunges the knife in his abdomen. Then, the women fight over the cop's gun, but the insane woman grabs it. When she points it at Carla, Sam arrives and begs her not to do it. Seconds later, the deputy appears and Debbie shoots him. The professor tries to grab her, but the woman takes the knife from the sheriff's torso and moves to stab Carla. To save his girlfriend, friend, Sam wraps his arms around Debbie, and the knife ends up in the unhinged woman's stomach. When the sheriff says he's okay, the couple goes to check on the deputy. However, with their backs turned, the older man calls their attention to the fact that Debbie escaped. The next morning, Mr. Carley's vehicle stops in the middle of the road when the driver spots an unconscious woman blocking the way. When the men go out to check, she's disappeared. However, when the hotel tycoon enters the car, he's surprised to find the injured woman in the back seat. Frantic, she explains that her alcoholic husband beat her and left her there. The older man says they'll call the police, but she tells him not to. So Mr. Carley says they can take her as far as the nearest town because he needs to see his daughter who's gotten into some trouble. Then, he remarks how much the woman resembles Tracy.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.